Nobody saw this coming. For decades, Africa was told it could never stand without the West. But today, in the heart of Burkina Faso, a young captain named Ibrahim Traoré is proving the world wrong, arming his people, building drones, and forging a new path that could shake the very foundations of global power. If this story moved you, hit like and share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to Faso Histories for more powerful stories that reveal Africa's untold truths. Burkina Faso stood at the edge of despair. For years, its villages were scarred by attacks, its soldiers outgunned, and its people left clinging to promises from foreign powers that never truly arrived. The air was heavy with grief, as families buried sons who had fought bravely, but with weapons too old to match the firepower of ruthless militants. Mothers cried into the night, children whispered questions no one could answer, and fathers clenched their fists in silence, knowing their country was being left to bleed. Foreign leaders offered speeches of sympathy, but the ground reality never changed. Help was always delayed, limited, or tied with strings of dependency. In this silence of betrayal, one figure began to rise. Ibrahim Traoré, a soldier forged not in luxury, but in the dust and heat of the battlefield. He had fought side by side with ordinary men, watched brothers fall at his side, and carried the same scars as those he now sought to lead. He knew the weight of sacrifice, and he knew that survival would never come by begging others to save them. When Traoré spoke, it was not the polished voice of politics. It was the raw, burning cry of a man who refused to bow. Burkina Faso will no longer kneel. We will stand, he declared, and his words cut through the despair like a blade through chains. Across the land, people who had been silent in fear lifted their heads with a spark of pride. Farmers in markets began to talk of courage. Children in schools began to dream of freedom, and soldiers felt a surge of strength they had not known in years. For the first time, Burkina Faso was not just surviving, it was preparing to rise. The turning point came when Ibrahim Traoré made a decision that would shake the foundations of Africa's struggle for independence. He refused to rely on foreign weapons and instead turned to his own people to build what they needed. For decades, Burkina Faso had been told it was too poor, too weak, and too dependent to produce its own tools of defense. But Traoré believed otherwise. In hidden workshops across the country, young engineers, mechanics, and soldiers worked shoulder to shoulder, welding, shaping, and testing machines that many thought impossible to create in such conditions. Sparks from the forges lit up the darkness, and the sound of hammers striking steel echoed like the heartbeat of a nation refusing to die. The first locally built drones, rough but reliable, rose into the air, symbolizing a new chapter for Burkina Faso, not one of dependency, but of defiance and creativity. These were not gifts from foreign powers wrapped in conditions and compromises. They were weapons born from the soil of the homeland and the determination of its people. Soldiers who once carried outdated rifles now trained with tools made by their own brothers, and in their eyes shone a new fire. Word spread quickly across villages, across borders, and across the continent. Markets buzzed with pride, families whispered prayers of gratitude, and neighboring nations watched in amazement as a country once seen as weak began forging its own strength. Traoré was not just building weapons. He was building hope, showing his people that true power does not come from outside, but from within. In every drone that took flight, and every weapon crafted by local hands, the message was clear: Burkina Faso would fight, not as a client of the West, but as a nation standing on its own. As Burkina Faso began unveiling its homegrown weapons and drones, the entire African continent turned its eyes toward Ouagadougou in disbelief. For years, nations across Africa had been told they could not survive without Western aid, without foreign training, without loans tied to impossible conditions. Yet here was a small, landlocked country scarred by war and poverty, proving that survival did not require begging. It required courage. From Mali to Niger, from Ghana to South Africa, people whispered Traoré's name with awe, some calling him reckless, others calling him a visionary, but none could deny that he had changed the conversation. In cafes and universities, students debated his bold defiance. In markets, traders spoke with pride that Africa was finally standing on its feet. And in military barracks of neighboring countries, young soldiers dreamed of leaders who would fight for them in the same way. The international media tried to dismiss Burkina Faso's progress as symbolic, but on the ground, it was more than symbolism. It was real, tangible, and unstoppable. Every drone that took off, every soldier trained on home-built equipment, became a message of resistance not just for Burkina Faso, but for an entire continent long trapped under foreign influence. Fear gave way to curiosity. Curiosity gave way to admiration. And soon admiration began to stir a dangerous question. If Burkina Faso could do this, why couldn't others? Across Africa, leaders were forced to look at their own dependence, and many feared that Traoré's defiance would ignite a fire they could no longer control. In villages across West Africa, people whispered, "The time of kneeling is ending." Burkina Faso, once ignored and underestimated, had become the beating heart of a new African awakening, and the world was watching nervously. The rise of Burkina Faso's defiance sent shockwaves across Western capitals, where politicians and strategists suddenly realized that a small African nation had exposed the weakness of their decades-long grip on the continent. For years, the West had maintained control through aid packages, military training programs, and promises of security, but Traoré's actions shattered that illusion. In Paris, Brussels, and Washington, meetings stretched late into the night as diplomats debated how a nation with limited resources could create drones and mobilize soldiers without their approval. Think tanks rushed to publish reports calling Traoré a dangerous populist, while media outlets tried to frame his defiance as reckless and unsustainable. Yet behind closed doors, fear was growing. If Burkina Faso's model spread, entire regions of Africa might break free from dependency. Sanctions were quietly discussed, foreign advisors were withdrawn, and attempts were made to pressure neighboring countries into isolating Ouagadougou. But the harder they tried to contain him, the more his popularity grew. On social media across Africa, young people mocked Western outrage, pointing out that the same powers who claimed to help had failed to stop bloodshed for decades. Meanwhile, Traoré showed no signs of retreat. He reminded the world that Burkina Faso was not rejecting cooperation, but rejecting control, declaring that Africa deserved dignity, not charity. His speeches were fiery, but grounded in a truth that resonated beyond borders. We will not be slaves in our own land. The West, used to compliance, was now facing a leader who refused to bend, and their panic revealed the cracks in their influence. What they had dismissed as a minor rebellion was turning into a symbol of resistance. And for the first time in decades, it seemed the game of power in Africa might no longer be theirs to play. When the first Burkinabe-built drones circled the skies and soldiers marched with weapons crafted by their own people, it was no longer just the story of one nation. It became the story of a continent daring to rise. Burkina Faso's defiance had broken a spell that had lasted for generations. The belief that Africa could not stand without the hand of the West. Across borders, ordinary people began to imagine a future where their nations could rely on their own engineers, their own farmers, their own soldiers, and not foreign powers who came with contracts and chains. In Mali, Niger, and beyond, young voices shouted Traoré's name, calling him the proof that Africa's destiny was not to serve but to lead. Leaders who once bowed to outside pressure now felt the growing tide of expectation from their people, and they knew change could no longer be delayed. Burkina Faso had turned tragedy into innovation, fear into strength, and isolation into inspiration, teaching the world that even the smallest nation could bend history if it had courage. The West, once confident in its dominance, now watched with unease as Africa's heartbeat quickened, louder and stronger than ever before. Traoré stood before his people not as a savior, but as a symbol, reminding them that true freedom is not given. It is built with sacrifice, resilience, and unity. And as the drones roared overhead like guardians of the nation, the people of Burkina Faso lifted their eyes to the horizon with new pride. What began as grief over 60 fallen soldiers had grown into a movement that no power could silence. The message was clear. A new Africa was rising, and this time, it would write its own story.